Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute most dramatic turnarounds in tech history, the total resurrection of AMD. Now, if you follow the semiconductor space, you probably already know AMD is an absolute powerhouse. But it really wasn't always this way. The mechanics of their survival and how they eventually dominated the market are just fascinating. We're going to move fast here, so let's break down exactly how they pulled this off.
So, here is the big question. Picture this. It's 2015, and AMD is effectively on life support. They were carrying massive debt, struggling just to stay in the game, and facing down a totally formidable monopoly. Yet today, they are an industry titan. So how on earth did a company on the verge of bankruptcy completely rewrite the rules of the computing landscape? To really understand this, we have to look at the sheer scale of the crisis they were dealing with. Back in 2015, things were bleak. Their stock had absolutely tanked to under $2 a share. They were weighed down by a staggering $2 billion in debt. They barely had any cash on hand, and they were just bleeding market share left and right. The margin for error here was literally zero. To survive long enough to even build a lifeline, they desperately needed cash, and the unsung heroes that actually kept the lights on? The custom chips designed for the PS4 and Xbox One back in 2013 and 2014. That specific division provided just enough steady, reliable cash flow to stave off bankruptcy. And while that was happening, AMD's engineers were quietly developing a secret weapon behind closed doors. All right, that brings us to Section 1, the Zen architecture and the chiplet revolution. This secret weapon was their do-or-die moment. AMD essentially took all their chips and bet the entire future of the company on a single, massive, ground-up redesign. For almost a decade before this, the market was just totally stagnant. Mainstream desktops were effectively trapped by a 4-core processor limit. AMD knew that to break that limit, they couldn't just keep building larger, error-prone, traditional monolithic chips. So they pivoted. They pioneered a radical new approach for x86 processors, moving away from that single massive piece of silicon. What they introduced was called the chiplet. Basically, a chiplet is a brilliant strategy where you take several smaller modular silicon dies and tie them together so they act as one cohesive, super powerful processor. It intuitively makes a ton of sense, right? Smaller dies mean way fewer errors during manufacturing. When you compare the two, the difference is just night and day. Monolithic designs inherently suffer from lower yields, and they are incredibly expensive to scale up. But chiplets? They gave AMD high yields, easy modular scaling, and drastically cheaper production costs. Because of this, they could affordably scale up to 16 cores for mainstream desktops. They completely shattered the industry's old limits. But here's the real kicker: the sheer performance leap this architecture enabled. AMD's internal goal was a respectable 40% improvement over their older chips, but they actually over-delivered, hitting a staggering 50% increase in instructions per clock, or IPC. We're talking about a massive boost in raw per-core processing speed. That boost is what forcefully kicked the door wide open for their comeback. From there, the rollout was just relentless. Zen 1 dropped in 2017 and aggressively disrupted industry pricing. Then, Zen 2 fully realized that chiplet design, heavily reducing costs while bumping up those core counts. And finally, Zen 3 arrived, unifying the cache design and allowing AMD to take the single-thread performance crown. Suddenly, their momentum was completely unstoppable. Now, having a brilliant design on a whiteboard is one thing, but you need flawless physical manufacturing to actually make it work. And that brings us to Section 2, the Foundry Wars, featuring TSMC versus Intel. So, historically, AMD used to manufacture its own chips, but back in 2008, they spun off their manufacturing arm into a company called GlobalFoundries. Honestly, that relationship was pretty rocky and plagued by a lot of delays. The real turning point came a decade later, when AMD entered into a historic, absolute game-changer of a partnership with Taiwan's TSMC to build their leading-edge chips. This partnership was the exact moment the market flipped. While AMD seamlessly transitioned to TSMC's cutting-edge 7nm nodes, their main rival hit a massive brick wall. Intel's internal foundry was really struggling to get their own 10nm process off the ground. It was a well-known issue in the industry. Tech outlets like Tom's Hardware were reporting that Intel's multi-patterning process was just generating way too many yield-reducing defects to produce chips cost-effectively. Intel's 10nm was heavily delayed until 2019, causing a severe multi-year stagnation for them. And this happened at the exact same moment
AMD had their foot entirely on the gas. And right in the middle of all this chaos, GlobalFoundries officially threw in the towel. Developing next-generation extreme ultraviolet lithography, those incredibly complex lasers needed to print tiny circuits, was just too expensive. When they exited the race in 2018, it actually freed AMD from their previous supply grants. They were now completely cleared to fully leverage TSMC's manufacturing superiority.
So by 2019, look at where things stood. TSMC was effectively the only player reliably pumping out next-generation silicon in high volume. Because TSMC executed flawlessly, AMD was able to launch their wildly successful Zen 2 and Zen 3 processors without facing the crippling supply bottlenecks that were just choking out their competition.
All right, let's bring it all together in our final section, Section 3, Technology at the Top. This is where we see how this perfect storm of architectural genius and flawless foundry execution brought AMD to the absolute top of the tech food chain. The results? Completely undeniable. By the third quarter of 2020, CEO Lisa Su was proudly announcing on their earnings call that they had the strongest product portfolio in the company's entire history. Between Ryzen desktop processors, mobile notebook chips, and EPYC server processors, demand was absolutely soaring, leading to record-breaking revenue. Just look at these growth numbers. They're staggering. In their enterprise, embedded, and semi-custom segments alone, they saw an explosive 116% year-over-year revenue increase. The cloud and server markets weren't just testing AMD hardware, they were aggressively adopting it. At this point, AMD wasn't just in survival mode anymore. They were playing for keeps. They set their sights on capturing a massive, long-term total addressable market. We are talking about a gigantic $110 billion opportunity spread across data centers, PCs, embedded systems, and gaming. To actually dominate a market that impossibly huge, AMD needed to bulk up, so they made a massive strategic play. They acquired Xilinx. This merger instantly transformed AMD into an $11.6 billion powerhouse, totally supersizing their financial scale and their engineering footprint overnight. So why Xilinx? Well, by combining AMD's existing CPU and GPU strengths with Xilinx's highly flexible FPGA technology, which are essentially chips that can be reprogrammed on the fly, they built the industry's broadest, most powerful computing portfolio. Suddenly, they were perfectly positioned to tackle everything from AI training to smart networking. And this wasn't just theoretical. That combined portfolio allowed them to expand incredibly fast. We're talking massive EPYC server deployments with cloud giants like AWS, Google, and Azure. They pushed straight into automotive and 5G infrastructure, all while their mobile notebook sales literally doubled year over year. You know, it is just incredibly rare to see a turnaround this absolute. In just a few short years, AMD completely rewrote the rules. They shed the dead weight of their own foundries, they heavily embraced the chiplet revolution, and they evolved from a struggling underdog right on the brink of collapse into the undisputed leader of high-performance computing. But you know tech, it never sleeps. As the whole landscape violently shifts once again, this time heavily toward artificial intelligence and edge computing, what bold move is AMD going to make next to defend this hard-won crown? Thanks for tuning in to This Explainer. Keep your eyes on the silicon because the next war, yeah, it's already begun.